Welcome back to Think Outside the Board. I'm your host, Brian Toohey, and this is another monthly update. This is the early November monthly update. And today we're going to be going over 16 games, starting with 10 different Kickstarters. I thought what would make the most sense is for me to start including the reasons why I'm recommending each Kickstarter. Because even though I'm trying to sort of pick out the best of the best, not every Kickstarter is for each person, and I'm certainly not going to be personally backing every Kickstarter that I recommend. There's just too many. First up, our first Kickstarter is Darkest Dungeon, which funds on November 6th, which is this Friday. And I am filming this on a Wednesday. I'm planning on editing it tonight and then getting it posted Thursday morning. So if you've got your little alarm bell clicked and you get a notification whenever new videos go up, you will be able to see this video before the campaign ends. It's a little later than I normally like to post, and I was just delayed because of the election. Really, just a lot of stuff happening this week. So first up on our list is Darkest Dungeon. It funds November 6th, and the reason that I'm recommending this one is because I played the video game, and the video game is a really, really good, really solid game. It's kind of like a roguelike where you're going in and you're fighting with a band of adventurers. Things are randomized in the dungeon that you're going through. And the game is pretty brutally difficult. So the way that you need to approach gameplay in the video game is to understand that you are not going to be having a group of adventurers in this fantasy setting that you are lovingly taking through a campaign. No. What is going to be more the case is that you're going to have many groups of adventurers, and you're going to have to, well, you're not going to kill them off, but the dungeon's going to kill them off. And you kind of have to use what you get from every, obliteration of your party to then fund and support another party, So you may kind of have a bunch of adventuring parties that are kind of just coming through this rotating door, and you're sort of, plundering them to build up your super party that you're actually trying to win the game with. So it is pretty brutal, and it looks like the board game has really, really captured the art style perfectly. And there are a lot of just amazing miniatures in this game. And it's already funded for a lot of money. Now, this one I am actually recommending. It's being published by a company called Mythic Games. And Mythic Games I'm having more and more sort of issues with as a publisher. And I'm going to put them in a category right now with Ludus Magnus Studio. Now, Ludus Magnus also has a game that's currently running. It's called Nova Itness Renaissance, which is sort of a redesign of a previous game that they did called Nova Itness, but retheming it a bit and hopefully improving it. Now, I'm not recommending Nova Itness Renaissance because Ludus Magnus is just too far behind on a lot of their Kickstarter deliveries. They have a slate of very big, very highly produced games that have just kind of gotten caught up in this backlog. And I don't feel comfortable recommending Nova Itness while that's the case. However, Mythic Games is in a similar boat. But I am recommending Darkest Dungeon. So it's like Darkest Dungeon is kind of sneaking through, whereas Nova Itness is not. And Mythic Games, one of their big things was the Joan of Arc game, which they initially launched, and it did some big business, and they came back and they did an even bigger Kickstarter later, but then they ended up being sued or in litigation over the Joan of Arc name, which also tied up another game they were co-producing called Legacies. Legacies shared sort of a subtitle with the Joan of Arc series, and so that got a little bit caught up into this kind of litigation. And I mean, none of that is good. You don't really want that going on when you're producing Kickstarters and trying to deliver them. But I think for me, the thing that allowed me to kind of push Darkest Dungeon over into a recommend was its ties to the video game theme and just how well the game kind of captured that art style. Now, if you are considering backing it, there are a couple things that you should probably be aware of. One is that the game works with a campaign. It's an 11 mission campaign that is played over 4 acts of a game. So it's not a short game, right? It's not a one and done. Your players do need to kind of be in for the long haul of this 11 mission campaign. Yet at the same time, like the video game, it is sort of roguelike, and it can be fairly brutal. And so you can very easily make it partway through the campaign and then just have your party be obliterated. And so I think for me personally, that's where the problem with Darkest Dungeon lies, is that I have some group of friends that really like, dungeon crawlers and kind of longer cooperative thematic games. They want to kind of be in for this long story and kind of experience all this story. But as I said, that campaign could just get cut short at any time. And you may have to kind of replay it and learn from your experiences and do things differently. And not every gamer wants to kind of have that reset kind of thing happening. I know a lot of gamers who kind of feel punished if they lose a game and they have to start over. They lose a campaign, partway through and have to start over. So that could be a negative for gamers who want to kind of just enjoy one long campaign that's not going to get stuck up, or where they lose and have to start over. At the same time, it is a campaign, so it's not a one-off. And I also have a lot of other friends who like Euro games, and they want to play games that are kind of one-time experiences. So they're not going to want to, be in for a campaign no matter the length. Which then leaves Darkest Dungeon in this kind of weird space where you need gamers who are ready to commit to, at least 11 game campaign, 11 missions, but who also aren't going to be bothered if that campaign is just truncated quickly, and who also will be, interested to restart that campaign and kind of play it over and over again. And that's not all gamers, that's kind of like this middle slice of gamers. So I know for me, I might have trouble getting Darkest Dungeon to the table. And when you combine that with the price tag, which if you go all in with it, and then you add in shipping and kind of all the extra stuff, you're looking at over a $300 price tag. So while the game actually looks really fun to me, and it looks like a great combination of the gameplay from the video game, along with, great miniatures and kind of this campaign setting and Eurogame gameplay, kind of is this nexus of all these things that I like. The problem is getting it to the table, and getting it to the table with a group that's going to be genuinely excited to play. And I think that would be very difficult for me. And when you throw that price tag on it, I don't think it's going to be something that I'm going to pledge. In fact, I know it's not. But if you have the right group and you're ready to buy an expensive game like this, and it could be a great experience. I mean, the art style and the kind of combination of gameplay mechanics and what they're pulling from the video game and kind of Euro mechanics looks like a very fun, fulfilling experience. But it's kind of understanding if you fall within that acceptable slice for that game. Also funding on 11.6 is Yedo Deluxe Master Set. And this is actually a second version of this campaign. The original Yedo Deluxe was on Kickstarter about a year ago, and the game's just delivered within the last couple months. So I think it's done really well. I think that in general, the gaming population is pretty excited for this, kind of design of Yedo. But I don't think the gaming population really knew that during the first Kickstarter. So it seems to have been possibly underfunded, and I think maybe there's more interest now than what there was during that original Kickstarter campaign, which is why it's kind of coming around again. Now, I did back it at that time, so I won't be backing it this time out. Don't need to. And I have not yet gotten a chance to play Yedo. But what I do know is that it's very much like Lords of Waterdeep, but it's a little more involved. It's a more complex game, and from people who don't mind more complex games, it's generally considered to be a better game than Lords of Waterdeep. If we say that Lords of Waterdeep is a medium light game, then Yedo's probably more in the medium heavy section. So there may be some gamers who still prefer that medium light experience of Lords of Waterdeep. But for people who have played Lords of Waterdeep and have kind of moved on and want something similar but meatier, Yedo could really be the game for you. And I'm excited to play it. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. And one day when I do, not only will you see some kind of reaction from me, either in the form of me just talking about it or an official review, I think I'll probably do some sort of a comparison video with Lords of Waterdeep to let you know how I think that the two games compare. But everything I hear about it is great. It's a really nice production. They've done a good job with it. I know because I've looked at it, I have it, but I haven't played it, so I kind of can't give you more information than that. But I would, from everything that I know, I definitely would recommend it to gamers who want, a step forward from Lords of Waterdeep or just a medium heavy worker placement game. Then on November 9th, BIOS, Mesofauna, and Galenus Fund. And these are two games being produced by Phil Eklund's studio and also, I think, Ion Design. And Ion Design is like a larger company, and Phil Eklund's studio is underneath the umbrella of Ion. So Ion is, I think, single-handedly responsible for Galenus, whereas BIOS Mesofauna is just Phil Eklund. But they're being packaged together in this Kickstarter, and you can back one or both or neither. So why would you want to back BIOS Mesofauna, right? Well, if you know the Eklunds and you know their company, and they make games like High Frontier, the BIOS series, and the PAX games, they make games that are very, very heavy, but also have this very, very high barrier to entry. So they definitely have a very passionate audience with some very heavy gamers. But their games they're fiddly, they have a lot going on, there's a lot of rules exceptions. So these are definitely games that aren't going to appeal to all gamers. You have to be on the heavy end, and then you have to also have some appreciation for the Eklund style of design, which is very, as I said, it's kind of fiddly and very cerebral. I myself have a couple games that I've backed from them that are kind of on the way. I think one of the BIOS games, I think the first one, and then two of the PAX games. And I already do own PAX Pamir, but I own the second edition of PAX Pamir, which was a redesign by Cole Worley. And that, I think, has kind of taken on a life of its own under Cole's kind of guidance. But the other PAX games are kind of more of a piece with each other. And I do have, I think, PAX Transhumanity, and maybe one other PAX game kind of like in the pipeline for delivery. So I'm personally at a point where I have not really played a lot of the Eklund games besides PAX Pamir, which isn't really theirs at this point. But I'm looking to dive into those games when I get those Kickstarters, when they eventually ship. And again, then I'll have more information for you guys, my audience, at that time. But BIOS Mesofauna is essentially a redesign and reimplementation of BIOS Megafauna. With the main difference being that they're trying to appeal to a lighter audience, and they're trying to make a lighter version of these kind of very heavy games. They did that already a little earlier in the year when they did a PAX game called PAX Viking. So it's kind of interesting that the Eklunds are trying to now court a lighter audience, maybe the medium to medium light gamers, with both PAX Viking and with BIOS Mesofauna. So, I mean, if you've ever been aware of the Eklund's games or these kind of games that I'm mentioning, but you think like, oh, that's too heavy for me, then maybe this is a time for you to kind of take a closer look and see if Mesofauna would appeal to you. As for Galenus, that is by, I don't want to say a first-time designer, because he has done a couple other very kind of small games, but I think this is his first game, that's kind of under the guise of a publishing company that maybe has more reach than two of the smaller games that he's done previously. And I haven't looked at Galenus too much. I don't know too much about the gameplay or how well it works or how well it's designed. I do know thematically it's set in Rome in 176, and players are playing doctors, and they're trying to cure patients, at that time, which I think is really, really interesting. They're going to be trying to patch up gladiators and then just dealing with kind of the weirdness and the oddities of medicine of that time period. And it's a Euro game. So I think thematically there's things in there that I definitely find interesting and I think could be very entertaining and even funny, depending on how you're curing or not curing these patients in this time period. So there's a lot of, I think, possibility there. But my recommendation is really more for Bios and Mesofauna than Galenus, although you can get either one or both through this campaign. Then on November 12th, there's a game called Usurper. Usurper is by the same design team who did The Blessed Dark, which is actually, you can back that right now as well if you do it through the Poketo collection Kickstarter that's currently running. But The Blessed Dark had been up on Kickstarter previously as its kind of own Kickstarter. And it looked pretty good for this very kind of small mint tin box game. And the design for it specifically looked very sharp, like just the way the art was and the design work. It really popped. And I'm not recommending the Poketo collection right now in this video, but I am, however, recommending the next game by those designers, and that is called Usurper. And Usurper is going to be a cheap game, and it's also a very light game and a quick game. Usurper reminds me a bit of a game called Fantasy Realms, which again is a very simple, light, kind of card-focused game where players each turn are selecting a card and discarding a card. And, well, in the beginning, they're just selecting cards and they're kind of building up a hand of cards. And then later in the games, they're selecting and discarding. But each card that they have has kind of a variety of scoring opportunities. And sometimes they work together and sometimes they work against each other. So over the course of this game, you're trying to kind of assemble a hand of cards that will score highest. So simple, right? Usurper seems very similar. It's a very simple game. You're just building up this tableau of 9 cards, and there's going to be different scoring opportunities among them. So it's up to you to kind of just assemble this 9 card tableau in a way that's going to score the highest. So it's simple, it's easy, it's quick playing. I think it's a very cheaper game, $22 with shipping in the continental United States. And the art too looks very, very good to me. I mean, it's got the sharp color on the cards, different colors depending on which faction you're using. And then it's kind of got this silhouetted black art on all the cards that's very striking and very sharp. And I do like to profile kind of up-and-coming designers whenever I can. I feel like they need the help. But, so many of them are not as solid or well-designed as larger games by bigger companies. Not that those games are all perfect, but at least they have, kind of a publishing structure behind the game to theoretically, help ensure that the game is going to be good. And when you're just kind of a lone person or two designing a game, it really just all falls onto you. So there are a lot of them out there. Not all of them are worth recommending, but when I find one that I think kind of sticks out from the rest, I really try to jump on it. And right now that is Usurper. And like I said, it's cheap. It looks good for what it is. Fairly quick, bright, attractive art. And I think it seems like there's going to be a lot of room for just different tactics and different scoring. And I think, for me, when I'm looking for smaller games, perhaps portable games that you kind of take with you and then whip out for a quick 15 to 30 minute game, this is one of those games that I think will probably fill that bill very, very nicely. Then on November 13th, Freedom 5, a Sentinel Comics board game funds. And this is a very interesting, I don't know, coming together. The correct word is escaping my brain. It's a very interesting kind of confluence of happenings, right? On the one hand, you've got the fact that Sentinels of the Multiverse, which a lot of people like, it's a superhero card game. I think it gets a lot of comparisons to something like maybe Marvel Legendary. now there is a board game version of it. And then also is the fact that this board game version is sort of a redesign and reimplementation of Defenders of the Realm, which was a fairly popular fantasy-themed game that came out around 2010. It's out of print. And I know over the last couple of years, there had been a lot of talk about whether it was going to be a new edition made for Defenders of the Realm. And I think Eagle Gryphon Games, who published the original, were planning on doing one within the last year. And it was something that kind of kept getting pushed back. And for the last couple of years, there was always this big question mark, was this going to happen? And Eagle Gryphon kept saying yes, and it kind of kept getting pushed back and back and back. And then finally, not too long ago, it was announced that no, they weren't not able to kind of complete whatever they needed to do for the licensing, and they were no longer going to be pursuing it. And I think this may have been part of the reason that the licensing had already been acquired for this game, this Freedom 5 Sentinel universe game. It may also be that they just didn't get the licensing for whatever reason, and now, the Sentinel's universe was able to grab the license. But either way, if you didn't know it, Defenders of the Realm is no longer happening. There will not be a second edition of that anytime soon. However, now you have this game instead. Now, Richard Launius, who was the designer of the original Defenders of the Realm and also did things like Arkham Horror, like the very first Arkham Horror, as well as at least one of the later editions, and also Elder Sign. He is back on board helping to kind of develop and design this game along with the Sadlers. And if you're like, oh, I think I knew who the Sadlers are, Adam and Brady Sadler, they've done a lot of Kickstarters lately. They've done some licenses like Street Masters, but they've also kind of been developing their own lines with games like Hour of Need, which is another superhero game. They did Brook City. They've got Alter Quest, which is kind of a fantasy dungeon crawler that's very, very, very focused on cards and deck building. The Sadlers tend to do a lot with deck building and deck construction. That seems to be kind of where they've been focusing their design efforts within their last half dozen games or so. And again, that is the case with this, but there's also kind of a lot of stuff happening on the board. And one of the things that I like the most about what I've seen of this new game is there have been a lot of superhero games, over the last decade. Some of them Marvel, a lot of them Marvel, a couple DC, and then things like Sentinel in the universe. And I know one criticism that a lot of people had with Marvel deck building is that the players never felt like the superheroes. They just felt like maybe shield agents or someone administrative who was kind of running the superheroes. And so you kind of felt like a superhero administrator, I guess, right? And that's not necessarily the experience that people want when they're going to play a superhero game. More recently, there's been like Marvel Champions, and a lot of other stuff, a lot of other superhero games. The Reckoners is another one. But even with the Reckoners, the gameplay seems to be like a management system of how you're dealing with villains and super villains. And kind of like, action points, and everything's kind of an efficiency puzzle. What I'm taking a long time to get around saying is that what I think is very unique about Freedom 5 and what makes it different is the idea that, yes, you are dealing with villains on the board in, Freedom 5, but you're also dealing with kind of a management system of small crimes and of people across the city who are just dealing with getting mugged and maybe stabbings and theft and robbery and stuff like that on a smaller level. And so a lot of times that in Freedom 5, that crime, if left unattended, will kind of increase and bubble up, and then you'll get, the supervillains. But there is this management system that kind of needs to happen kind of for lower level crime. And the superheroes need to be interacting with kind of the general public and taking care of them. And that's very different That's very different from anything I've seen in other superhero games. This is kind of like responsibility of managing the city and its occupants and lower level crime, and doing a good job of that will then kind of facilitate the hero's ability to take on the villains and the supervillains. And I think as a superhero, that's definitely something that you would have to be dealing with, and it hasn't really been portrayed in other superhero games. So that makes me really excited for this game and makes me really want to play it. And I don't think that I'm going to be backing Freedom 5. I think I'm only going to be backing one game from this list, or actually two games from this list. But if I was going to add a third, it would be Freedom 5. And even right now, I'm sort of trying to think about, oh, can I back it? Should I back it? It looks like a really good, solid game, an interesting amalgamation of mechanics. You've got the cooperative fantasy element. It works with action points and hand management, of course, because it's the Saddlers, and that seems to be their kind of forte. So a lot of good stuff, and I think it's occupying a little bit different of the superhero space than most of the other superhero games that are out there. So if you like the Sentinels of the universe, or if you were thinking you might want to get Defenders of the Realm when it reprinted, which is not going to happen anymore, or if this kind of superhero game sounds interesting to you, then I'd recommend you take a look at this one. I think it's one of the better games out there right now. Also funding on the 13th is Kokopelli. And this is yet another Stefan Feld game. And he's just been kind of going great guns lately. Over the last couple of years, through normal retail markets, he's put out Forum Trajanum. He did Carpe Diem. He just had Bonfire hit recently, which has been getting pretty good reviews. And then also there was a recent Kickstarter through Queen Games for Hamburg and Amsterdam, which are kind of re-themings and redesigns of Bruges and Macau. So there's been a lot of Stefan Feld stuff out there lately. And, here's another one. It's Kokopelli. And I think what's kind of neat to me is that Kokopelli looks a little bit like something like a battle line, where you're going to have kind of all these different sets of things that you're competing for. I think you need to get like 3 or 4 of each set, but there's like 15 different categories. So you're simultaneously kind of battling it out between, I think it does 2 to 4 players, where Battle Line is just 2-player only. But you're battling it out for all these different kind of mini set collections, right? There's like, let's say 13 or 14 groupings, and you're trying to get the majority of each. And I think it looks like it's not super expensive. It's not cheap though, because they're doing a fairly nice version of it. And if you're super excited about it, you can also, through this campaign, pledge Merlin, and you can kind of get the kind of big box everything for Merlin. And I think both Kokopelli and Merlin are having like a nice set of game trays and organizers. It looks good, which is interesting, right? Because it's Queen Games, and Queen Games is kind of known for not making the prettiest or most well-produced games out there, which is, I think, part of the problem with Stefan Feld games right now, is that even if you really like Feld, so many of his games are just getting produced with, mediocre kind of cardboard token quality. But Kokopelli does look a little bit better. Like I said, they have a nice game tray system. I think most important, though, is that it is a kind of lighter set collection game where there's kind of this competition happening for all these different sets. And the art on it, again, it's very kind of, has these black icons on them, and it looks very, I don't want to say iconic, iconographic, but it also looks sharp. And Feld is a good designer. He designs enough that not every game is going to be a huge hit. But this one looks really good to me, and it looks like another kind of, not super light, maybe medium light game, but it can play fairly quickly. It's got good strategy involved, and it's kind of a tight head-to-head battle, even when it's up to 4 players. And then on November 14th, we have another game with the Saddlers involved. This one's called Dire Alliance Horror. Now, we've got both Saddlers involved in this one. But we've also got David Thompson and his designing partner, Trevor Benjamin. And that pair is responsible for the Undaunted games, which you may have heard of, kind of war games, as well as War Chest. And War Chest is a really neat game. It's kind of a war game, but it's very abstract. And you're kind of putting these tokens out, bringing these tokens onto the board, and they all kind of have different powers. And it's a very tactical game that varies very, very much each game, because the units that you're using are going to be different, and it employs this kind of bag building mechanic. And I think War Chest is a great game. I haven't played the Undaunted games, but I've heard really good things about them. So you've got that pair of designers working with the Sadlers, and they've made this game that it takes place on a map. And if you look up some videos right now, you'll see, teaching videos, you'll see cardboard tokens being used in it. But this will be a miniatures game, so you will have a level above the cardboard tokens. Like, even though the gameplay may be solid when you're watching the teach videos or the playthrough videos, it may look like it's missing a little something because they're just moving around cardboard tokens. But when the Kickstarter finishes, there will be miniatures, which will make the game look even sharper. And a lot of what this game is just it's kind of a skirmish game, really. And it uses line of sight between dots on the game board. So you kind of have, the game board has all these zones on it, but it's not just an empty board. There are also different areas of obstruction. So if you can draw a line between the dot in the area that you're in and the dot in the area that something else is in, you can do an attack. But if you can't draw that line, you can't do it. So it's going to be very much about kind of like grid movement or point-to-point movement, but also about this kind of line of sight thing. And it's also going to heavily rely on card management, all these cards. So you're going to be using kind of hand management and deck construction to move the characters around on the board and take various kind of like skirmishy attack actions. And knowing the caliber of the designers, both pairs of designers, I have a very good feeling about this game in the long run. And I think it should also be known that it's called Dire Alliance Horror. And it's intended, I think, to be the first game in possibly a series. So if it does well, you may see future iterations that are, like Dire Alliance Fantasy or Dire Alliance Cyberpunk. It may end up being kind of like the Unmatched games, which are different from the Undaunted games I was talking about. But the Unmatched games are the ones that kind of pit together all these characters from throughout history and as well as fiction, and have them kind of fight against each other. So you may eventually see something like that with Dire Alliance, where you can kind of throw these different thematic versions of the game together and see what kind of crazy combinations that you can come up with. That's a ways off yet. If it happens, I think it will. But in the meantime, we've got this first iteration, Dire Alliance Horror. And the game looks good. I'm really excited to try it at some point. Okay, now Thursday Brian is actually helping Wednesday Brian film, because I somehow forgot to mention probably the most important Kickstarter on the list when I did the Wednesday filming. So Thursday Brian is now here to help, wearing the same clothing so it won't look weird, but telling you what's going on, making it weird anyway. On November 17th, Endless Winter Paleoamericans funds. And this is probably the Kickstarter of the month, of all the Kickstarters that are actually funding in November. And it's designed by Stan Kordonsky, who kind of got his feet wet doing Dice Hospital and Lockup, a role-player tale. And then he did Rurik. And Rurik was fairly successful, but I think it was one of those games that gamers didn't really have a great idea of when the original Kickstarter was out. But then it shipped, people played it, it was very successful, people seemed to love it. So it had a second Kickstarter recently, and for months all around that, Jeremy Howard of Jambalaya Plays Games and Man vs. Meeple was just talking it up like crazy. It's obviously one of his favorite, I think he said it's his favorite game of the year that it came out, which was maybe 2019. But anyway, so that really alerted me, and I did kind of a deep dive into the game. And then when when that second campaign was up fairly recently for Rurik, I jumped on and I got all the stuff. And I think that was the beginning of Stan Koronski really coming into his own, I guess, as a very popular board game designer. And now we're seeing Endless Winter, and this game has kind of been hailed as his magnum opus, or at least for now, right? Because he's hopefully going to have many more games in the years to come, and maybe something will eclipse Endless Winter eventually. But for now, just the advanced word on Endless Winter is amazing, is that it's amazing. And my feelings about this game are kind of the way I feel if there's a movie that's coming out in the theaters that I know that I'm going to love, where I kind of want to not really learn too much about it. Like once I know that I'm going to like it and I'm really excited about it, I kind of just don't want to hear anymore. I just want to go see it and be surprised. So that's kind of my feeling about Endless Winter at this point. I'm just so excited for it. I don't really want to learn more about it right now. I just want to receive the game. But it's got some worker placement in it. It's got deck building and hand management. It's got multi-use cards and tableau building. And it's just a whole bunch of really good Euro mechanics that are supposed to be, from what has been said, working together really, really well. And then on top of that, it's got art by the Miko, who did the art for Paladins of the West Kingdom, Architects of the West Kingdom, Viscounts of the West Kingdom, Raiders of the North Sea, Shipwrights, Explorers of the North Sea, Cavern Tavern, Rise to Nobility, and a lot of the Valeria games. They're all the Miko. And I love the Miko's art. I think he just does really, really great character art. It's just both well drawn and exciting. Usually there's some humor to it, and it is he does a lot of, all the West Kingdom and of the North Sea games. It's like a lot of Vikings and stuff like that. And so now this is Endless Winter, Paleoamericans. So it's Native Americans, around the Paleolithic period. And I just love Miko art. So that's another huge checkbox for it. And then there's also, there's some resin markers in the game at the kind of higher Kickstarter levels, which look really, really good. Nice kind of chunky, attractive, resin markers. There's also some miniatures for the clan chiefs, because like most Euro games, you're going to be using some kind of a faction. So depending on the faction that you choose, there'll also be a miniature for you, player miniature. And the miniatures are modeled on the Miko's character art. And I think this is the first time that we're going to see, Miko designed miniatures in a game. So that's going to look really cool as well. But yeah, this is my game for November. If I was only getting one game in November, it would be this game. I'd recommend, if you're only getting one game in November, to pledge this one, unless you don't like Euros. It looks like it's probably going to come in around the medium heavy level as well. So, but it just looks great. I'm really excited about it. Go check it out. Go back it. You don't need to know anything more about it. It's Stan Koronski's magnum opus. It's the Miko art. It's going to be this great chunky Euro game with all of these really well-designed, well-integrated mechanics. After that, on November 18th, is Feed the Kraken. Now, Feed the Kraken is a game I feel sort of obligated to tell you about, even though I am not backing it. I won't be backing it. And the reason is it's a social deduction game, and I am not a huge fan of these kinds of social deduction or deduction games. I particularly don't like games like Coup or The Resistance or The Resistance Avalon. It's not really my game, and that's exactly the kind of game that Feed the Kraken is. So it's not for me, but for people who like those kinds of games, Feed the Kraken looks like the best of the bunch. And the reason is it's not just this kind of social deduction game. You have a full board, and there are 3 different teams. There's going to be sailors, there's going to be pirates, and there's going to be some sort of trader who's trying to get the group to sacrifice themselves. I think it's the Cthulhu. And as you're doing the different missions like you would normally do in a Coup or a Resistance, each kind of, standalone little grouping mission, when you when you declare a character becomes a captain, and then they kind of recruit who's going to go out with them on a mission, and then they kind of vote whether they're going to succeed on the mission or not. Normally, when you're playing those kinds of games, you just need to get to win a certain number of the games. Like, let's say it's 3 out of 5 rounds you need to win to be victorious. In this game, with each mission, it's going to result in you steering a pirate ship. And there are some very kind of chunky, well, the pirate ship is a miniature, but there are also these kind of chunky tokens that represent other things that could happen in the game. Perhaps little observation actions if you go on to a hex that has like a magnifying glass token on it. But there are other tokens that can do other things. And so after each mission, you're then kind of determining whether the ship is going to steer this way or steer that way. And so the pirates are kind of trying to get the ship to steer to one side of land, and the sailors are trying to get it to steer to the other side. And the character that wants the sacrifice to be made is trying to kind of to get the ship to steer right down the middle to Cthulhu. So I like the idea that there's kind of this board involved and there's more mechanics involved than a normal social deduction game. But it doesn't seem to me to overwhelm the social deduction. It seems to just kind of bolster it and improve upon it and give you a few more things to think about, some more kind of tactics and strategy. So I like that about it. As I said, it's not really my genre, so I'm not going to be rushing out to back it. But if it's your genre, you really should take a look at this because I think it's going to do this better than any of the other games out there. Then on November 19th, there's a game that's funding called Core Space Firstborn. And this is an interesting game for me to recommend because it's not by a huge company. The company is called Battle Systems. So they don't have an extensive track record. And in fact, a lot of what they've been doing in past Kickstarters is kind of developing terrain systems. And what they've settled upon are these kind of cardboard terrain systems. A lot of it, I think, you kind of fold it together and you create a lot of 3D cardboard terrain. It's kind of like, it stands, I won't call it standees because it's not just like one piece. It's all the terrain. You're kind of building things and putting it together. And I don't know if it's going to fit into the box once it's assembled. So that could be an issue if you kind of have to build it and then unbuild it every time. But the terrain itself, once assembled, it looks pretty cool. And they had a previous Kickstarter and that shipped in 2019. That was the first Core Space game. And if you look it up on Board Game Geek, right now it's sitting with an 8.9 rating, which is pretty good. And it has over 500 votes. So it's not like just a few people who worked on the game, voted for it and all gave it 10s. And so it has a high rating. It has some votes. It has some votes behind it. And from the things that I've seen, it looks pretty damn good. I think for a lot of campaign gamers and Euro gamers, it's maybe a little bit more of a step into a miniature skirmish game, more than they may want. It has different scenarios where you're trying to complete objectives to win the scenario. And because it's kind of very, very focused on the miniatures and this kind of cardboard terrain, maybe it's too far into kind of miniature skirmish games for some gamers who want something that's a little more just kind of organized and pre-packaged. But it's also not the kind of miniatures game where they just give you some minis and some very vague rules and kind of let you go off by yourself. Like this, it is structured. It does have a campaign. It does have goals. It does have sets of mechanics. It's also cyberpunk themed, which I think is kind of an underutilized theme out there. There are a lot of dungeon crawlers that are fantasy themed, some that are horror themed, but you don't see as much kind of steampunk or cyberpunk stuff out there. So I think if you're looking for a dungeon crawler that has a cyberpunk theme, that has some really, really interesting, sharp terrain that's a little different from things that are out there, but still looks really, really, really good. And it's got this previous version out there that exists that has, a solid rating behind it. So hopefully it allows you to be a little more confident about the universe that they're building. And you're not just jumping in quite so blind. And that's on November 19th. And then the last game, it's also the November 19th, and that is Townsfolk Tussle. And Townsfolk Tussle, I'm backing this one. It looks crazy. That's all I can say. It looks crazy. It has this art style behind it that's very much like, 1920s kind of old school Warner Disney animation. It also looks quite like the recent video game Cuphead. So it's just this weird, vintage cartoon art style, but then it's taking the gameplay from Kingdom Death Monster and it's creating, like, again, it's a kind of a mini skirmish game, but it's focused on this very weird art design with kind of this strange, almost sick sense of humor, and it looks fantastic. I'm really excited about it. Now, I do have one friend who played it a couple times online and doesn't like it. And I think part of that is that he's played it at 2. He said it doesn't really play very well at 2. So I think if you're thinking about buying it, you're going to want to be thinking about playing it with 3 to 4. I think that's more where the game is going to shine. The other thing is, it is very much intended as more standalone. So this is kind of a game that you're going to be able to pull out, maybe teach to people that aren't, the gameriest gamers, but there may be things about it that appeal to them, like the art style and the kind of craziness of it, and the fact that even though it's kind of Kingdom Death inspired, and it has some of those same battle systems, it is really meant to be played kind of in one-stop sessions. So, we get some people together, we play the game, we put it away. It's not meant to have like 300 hours of campaign. So if that is what you want, if you want that huge long campaign, then maybe this isn't going to be the game for you. But if you want that kind of like experience of boss fight where you're working together cooperatively and it's going to be tough and you're not always going to win and there are things that you can do to improve, and this kind of, 1920s vintage cartoon art style really speaks to you, as does the ability to get this played kind of more as one-offs and perhaps introduce it to people that aren't kind of dyed-in-the-wool gamers. I think this game could be really, really unique and kind of occupy a space in your collection that no other game is probably going to be sitting in. So that wraps up this session, and that was 11 of the 15 games that we're going to talk about today. So I don't really have as many games for you in the other sessions as I normally do. First up, I do have one arrival. I'm going to kind of show you the pieces of it. So this is expansion number 1. Actually, that was expansion number 2. This is expansion number 1. I've got some player screen, and this is the big base box. It's a, look at that. It takes up the whole camera. This is a big box. So this game is called Detective City of Angels, and I have another game that's detective themed that I've talked about called Deadline, which is very much just cards, very kind of minimal. It's very cards, and you're trying to solve cases. And then I have some other detective themed games like Detective, a modern board game, and on the way, the Millennium series of Chronicles of Crime. So all those games kind of operate in a similar space to me. What makes this one unique is the fact that, well, first of all, like those other games, there are cases that you're going to be playing. I think in the base game, there's maybe like 11 cases, and then obviously the expansions have more. But those are cases where there are definitely answers, like there are set answers. It's not randomized from scenario to scenario. So once you play through a case, you kind of can't play it through again. You already know the answers. So there is a limit in some ways to what a player can play. And once we throw in the expansions, I think you go from 11 to, I'm not sure how many, probably a total of 20 to 25 cases. Let's say there's like 6 to 7 cases in each of the expansions. But in that way, you could look at it as a legacy game, where there was a set number of things you can actually play before you get to the point where you're repeating yourself. Now, you can play it cooperatively with everyone working together against the game itself, and you can kind of have it be operated by the game. But it works better if you have someone in a role. It's kind of a dungeon master role, which is what this player screen is for. And I believe in Detective City of Angels, they call that GM type character the Chisel. So, and from everything that I've read and researched and things, I think it's a better experience if you have a player playing the Chisel. But what that means is that whoever's playing the Chisel is also going to have the case ruined for them, right? They're going to find out all the answers to it. So I guess ideally you'd like to have a character playing the Chisel who's already played the game. So you could kind of go through, like, let's say I wanted to play all the cases together with my fiance and have that kind of narrative experience together. Well, then I could take the game to my game groups and I could still play it with me playing this role of the Chisel, this like DM, GM role, and kind of improving and facilitating the gameplay for a group of friends who would be playing it cooperatively together. There's kind of neat things that the Chisel can do in terms of lying to players or not giving them the whole truth, or kind of screwing them with them a little bit. And so I think that's where the game is going to shine. However, I know for myself there'll be a little bit of a disappointment because I'll need to play at least a few scenarios without the Chisel if I want to experience the cases for the first time as a player, right? Unless I know someone else who's played the game and wants to be a Chisel, which seems unlikely. But the game itself looks really well designed, and I love the art style for it. I like the way they have the board. They've kind of used historical map of Los Angeles to create the board. And this is a game I'm going to need to report back to you on, but I'm excited for it. I think it's going to be pretty cool. So cool that I was willing to, back it, knowing that there is kind of a limit to the gameplay of this game. Now that brings us to the section of what I pledged since the last video, and I've only pledged one game in this time period, and that is Frostpunk, the board game. And you can go back to the previous video and hear me talk about it more, but it's by the designer of Nemesis, Adam Kwapinski, and it just looks like a really thematic, really well-designed Euro game. It takes place in kind of a Frostpunk dystopia, and it's also implements a video game, but it's a city management simulation where players are kind of also playing against each other and trying to vie for control of this apocalyptic city. And the theme looks great, the art looks great, there's a lot of miniatures, there's shading on them, and to me it just looks like it's a heavily thematic Euro game, which is totally my sweet spot. And so that is why that was the one game I backed this period. I'm really excited for that one. And then that brings us to the two games that I played during this period. Now, it was Halloween, and so the two games that I played are kind of horror themed. The first is T.I.M.E Stories, and I've played T.I.M E Stories a few times. We've never actually finished the base game, so we went back and we're replaying the base game. And I think we need a few more plays of it to finish and figure out how to be really kind of efficient with what we're doing and to solve the mystery. But I love T.I.M E Stories. I really like it. It's a very simple, light game. It's very narrative. It's sort of a choose your own adventure book in a board game form, where you're walking around and you're doing things and you're solving puzzles. And it also reminds me of some of the old text adventure computer games, back in the 80s. So, you're walking around, you're finding items, you're acquiring them. Maybe you need items to do something in a different location. Maybe whatever that gets you is not particularly helpful. So you're kind of going through, you're experiencing the story, you're trying different things, and then with what you learn, you play it again and you go through and you try to do things better, and then eventually, you kind of like your strategy kind of focuses in, and hopefully you solve it. And it's had a lot of expansions made for it. I already have 2, so I'm very much looking forward to finishing the base game and trying the first 2 expansions. I would like to get all the expansions, but as you may be aware, they kind of redesigned Time Stories within the last year or 2, and so now they're doing a whole new cycle of Time Stories games, and each one's kind of standalone. I'm not sure if they're blue. I think they're all blue, and so it's called the Blue Cycle, whereas the first one was called the White Cycle. And in the original series of games, you needed the base game, and then all of the expansions worked off of that. And the expansions are a little smaller, a little cheaper, because you already have, the kind of more expensive base. It's almost like a console for playing this type of game, right? And then you get the different expansions, and you can kind of plug them into this game system. But as I said, with the Blue series, each one's going to be a standalone, which means each one's probably going to be more expensive. But I do worry a little bit if the expansions for the first series are going to go out of print, because I don't see why. Is it WizKids? I think it's WizKids who makes it. I don't know why they would continue to support it if they're kind of focusing their efforts on this new cycle and these new standalone games. So that may need to be something that I keep an eye on and try to grab, those expansions when I can find them cheap, and also just when they're available. But I really like it. I think if you like narrative games, you should check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's a cooperative experience. I think the only negative about it is because it is a cooperative game, there could be a tendency for some people to try to kind of alpha game in this one. So you just have to make sure that you play it with a good collaborative group who are generally going to work together. And also, this is another game where you're going to die. You may die often. So you have to be playing this with players who are okay with that and see that as not necessarily a setback, but a challenge to break the game out again, learn from what you did, and then kind of hone in on a workable final strategy. But I like it. I like that kind of stuff. So it's a fun experience for me. And then the other game that we played was Mansions of Madness. And interestingly enough, I've played Mansions of Madness, I think, twice before. The intro scenario both times. One time was with my fiance, who didn't love it because she didn't like the combat. She tends to really not like super competitive games like with Take That. But then she also doesn't like games that have a lot of randomness, which Mansions of Madness certainly does. And I've also played it once with some friends at a game group, and I think everyone enjoyed it that time. I don't remember if I won the scenario either time, although I do remember during one of them, I think some of the people in our group successfully completed the scenario, and one character, I think it was me, was left on the docks insane as the other characters kind of sailed off into the sunset. So I think I may have been present for a victory, even if I didn't share in it. But I like the Mansions of Madness games. I like Cthulhu-themed games in general. So kind of like Eldritch Horror, Arkham Horror, like Elder Sign to some degree, although I'm less a fan of the dice rolling. Arkham Horror, the card game. I really like those horror-themed, exploration-heavy games. So anyway, in the play that we did this time, we actually played, I think it's called Rising Tides, which is the longest scenario in the Mansions of Madness box. It's, I think, estimated to be like a 4 to 6 hour game. And it is the scenario that people seem to dislike the most because it's very, very investigation focused, and there's very little combat in it until the end of the scenario. And so I think a lot of people play that scenario, and it's very long, and because there's no combat, they find it boring. I don't find that kind of gameplay boring, and neither does my fiance. In fact, we picked it because that was the one she wanted. She didn't want to play either of the other two scenarios that were much more combat focused. So we played that scenario. We had a really good time with it for most of the 4 to 6 hours of it. But even in that, you are kind of making choices as you do things in the game, and you are never going to be able to kind of do everything. And in this particular scenario, you're trying to get information on who 2 of 6 cultists are, and then you need to stop this ritual. And you're also trying to find out kind of where the location of the ritual is. And so this game is kind of divided into 4 different locations. And I think it's so long because each location, depending on how quick the players play, could take between a half an hour to an hour and a half or something. So 4 locations, 2 to 6 hours. And then there's I think there's a last, like a 5th location sort of for the finale. So we were having a really good time playing the game, and then we got to the end, and we both chosen characters that were very, very weak on strength and agility, and did well with things like will and lore and observation, which are generally the skills we need for this mainly investigation focused scenario. But of course there was combat at the end, and I made the very big mistake of trying to shoot some of these monsters at the end with a pistol, while agility was my worst stat, which means that I missed them 3 actions in a row, and I ended up dying. And then I left my fiance alone, who was playing, I think her name was Agatha Crane, who's like this old woman with a cane. And somehow, because they were all attacking her on like observation and lore skill set levels, she managed to stay alive for quite a while, and she kind of had 4 of these old ones battling her, and she's just this old lady with a cane, and she was holding them off for several turns. And it was hilarious, and we had a really good time watching this, but we knew that we weren't going to be able to succeed because at that point it was ridiculous. And so I think we're both kind of looking forward to replaying that scenario, although we have to find the time to do it because it's not a short scenario. And I think we'll be able to take what we learned and hopefully beat it next time. Because when you play a 4 to 6 hour scenario, you don't really want to lose at the very end. It's a little disheartening after all that time. But like I said, we did have so much fun with it, and we had fun at the ridiculousness of the end and the old lady kind of being alive with 4 old ones, that it was okay. We still had a really good time with it. But yeah, I sort of don't know what to do with Mansions of Madness and the other games, because I also have Arkham Horror, and I have Arkham Horror, the card game, and I also have Elder Sign, and I don't think I need all those games, so I need to make some decisions about which of those games I'm going to eventually pick up all the expansions for, and which ones I'm going to let go and sell. And I have a feeling, I don't know. I mean, Elder Sign's definitely going, because it's very random, it's very dice-centric. Arkham Horror, the card game, I think I want to keep that one. But it is a case where you play this through the scenarios and you're kind of learning the scenarios, and there's some randomization so you can repeat them. But it's not cheap. There's a lot of expansions, so I'll have to think about whether I want to go in on that or maybe go in on Marvel Champions. And so if I don't continue with Arkham Horror, the card game, maybe I'll keep the new 3rd edition, and then I need to figure out what to do with Mansions of Madness. So it's like there will be something sticking around. I just don't know which version yet. But a part of me really does love Mansions of Madness. It's not a heavy game. It's something that light gamers can really enjoy. You use an app for it, which you can do on an iPad or a laptop. That's a little bit of a barrier for some, but I liked it. I enjoyed it. And then mostly what you're doing in Mansions of Madness is kind of walking around, building a map, somewhat like you do in Betrayal at the House on the Hill. But it doesn't have that trader aspect of it. Everyone's still working together, and they're going around the map, and then there are different tokens that get laid on the map, and generally you're interacting with those tokens. You might be searching something specific, a specific area in the game. You might be exploring a new room. There might be things that you're doing, but in general, you're just moving around the board. You're interacting with different things, and then you're involved in combat, and the amount of combat depends, it changes from scenario to scenario. But it's not a very heavy game. There's not a lot of like super involved crunchy choices. It's just kind of pure surface level fun with some randomness in it, and it's largely exploration. So I really enjoyed both of the games that I played. I'm hoping that we get to play Mansions of Madness again soon, and T.I.M.E Stories as well. So anyway, that brings us to the close of another video. And as for the channel, a couple little things. I have worked on a 7th Continent how to play or teach video. I think I'm actually gonna go back and redo it because I want to make it very short. I think there's a way to do it very, very short. And then I'm going to be doing at least one gameplay video for it, more if people want it. And I think this video I'm recording right now will probably get posted tomorrow on Thursday. And I think you'll see the teach for 7th Continent go up over the weekend at the latest, followed by a gameplay video for 7th Continent early next week. And then in 2 weeks, you'll see another one of these. And then I need to kind of decide where I'm going to go from there. I am trying to transition more and more to videos, and I'm probably going to be spending less time on the columns of the site. But that's still kind of in process right now. But it's something that I'm looking forward to, because I do think that the future of the channel is going to be more in video. So it's kind of going to be about me finding the way to best transition to that in the immediate future. Also, at some point in the next few weeks, I'll be throwing up a Patreon and not doing too much with it in the beginning, but just putting it up there to get, the ability for people to throw a few bucks or, support this channel with some monthly funding. And as time goes on, we'll start to build more value into that and more kind of exclusive things. And I think the more we shift to doing video, the more we'll have stuff that we can kind of add on to the tiers of the Patreon. But just in the next week or two, I'd like to get that up just to kind of get things started with that. And that's it. Those are our plans for the immediate future. Thank you very much once again for watching this video. Please like, please subscribe, and then if you want, you can hit the alarm bell so that you're notified on publication of future videos.